Hallo, u weet het misschien niet meer, maar u heeft een vijftal verwoestende zaken op de aarde overleefd. We spreken van uitroeiingen, van extinctions. Er zijn er 5 geweest. De laatste was deze waar de dinosaurussen zijn verdwenen. Maar er bestaat zoiets als de sixth extinction. En laat het nu het toeval zijn dat ene Ida Marie Olsen uit Noorwegen daar een prachtig doctoraat heeft over gemaakt. En dat doctoraat heet Fictionalizing the Sixth Mass Extinction. Roots, Exclusions and Biases. And fortunately, we are very fortunate rather to have Ida with us here today to explain what the sixth mass extinction is and what the methodology is that she used and so on. So very welcome, Ida.
Thank you, Mark.
To this talk. Ida, just a preliminary question. When in your life did you decide that one day you would be a doctor of philosophy, that you would obtain your PhD?
Yeah, so I think I decided that quite early on, actually. As a person, I've always loved learning. I like reading and writing. So I think it was probably from quite a young age that I decided that, yeah. I don't remember the exact moment.
You were sitting in class as a little girl, and you said, one day I want to be a PhD.
Yeah, maybe. I don't remember the exact sort of time, but yeah, I think I was quite young when I decided that I wanted to do a PhD, yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Now, the other wonderful thing about you is that you are very international, because I haven't mentioned yet that you are Norwegian, that you studied at the University of Oslo, that you did your BA, a Bachelor of Arts there, and then you switched to Britain, where you went to Exeter, where you obtained your master's degree, and then you turned to Ghent at university, where you did your dissertation for Professor Stef Craps.
Yes.
Why did you come to Belgium?
Yeah,
Because
so it was a little
for that, right?
Yeah, it was a little bit of a coincidence. So when I finished my master's degree, I already knew which sort of subfield of literary studies I wanted to do my PhD in. Right. So that was what we call environmental humanities, so how literature engages with environmental questions. And a few months after I'd finished my master's degree, I saw that there was a PhD scholarship advertised online. It was at Ghent University in Belgium, and that was specifically in environmental humanities. Mm-hmm. So I applied for that, and I was not expecting to get it because it's very, PhD scholarships are very competitive. But then for some reason I did get it, and I came to Belgium in 2018, yeah.
Right. And not incidentally, Stef Craps is one of the leading scholars, let's say, on what they call cli-fi, right?
Yes.
Climate change fiction related studies, right? And that was exactly what you wanted.
Yeah, so kind of. So I felt that there was actually a lot of work being done specifically on this notion of climate change and literature. So there's even this sort of literary genre, as you said, cli-fi. Mm-hmm. And to me, that was a little bit problematic, that there was so much focus on climate change in environmental humanities. Mm-hmm. Because we know that, of course, climate change is very serious, but there's also a very severe environmental crisis happening right now, which is the biodiversity loss crisis, where non-human species are driven to extinction by us humans. So for me, the idea of looking at sort of climate change and how that has consequences for humans that was a little bit too sort of anthropocentric, human-centric for me. I've always been interested in cultural representations of animals. And for me, it was important that we sort of turn our attention more to the non-human or the more than human at a time when sort of we humans are causing the extinction and depletion of sort of non-human animal populations. So, yes.
Right. Now, extinction as such is, in fact, more of a sort of biological theme, let's say. But what you did was you connected that with fiction. And you studied how it was represented in fiction. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, so the overarching question of my PhD then was how does contemporary literature, so literature published during the last 30, 40 years, how does it engage with the sixth mass extinction of species? And I was also particularly interested in how literature provides this unique means of diversifying and sort of enriching the conversation around the sixth extinction. Because if we look around us at how extinction is dealt with in society, there is something almost sort of inherently apocalyptic about this idea of a sixth mass extinction. So we have a lot of post-apocalyptic narratives that deal with this. And we have, for instance, Extinction Rebellion, the activist group, which really highlights these sort of messages of climate emergency and ecological breakdown. And for me, that's a little bit sort of an oversimplification of how the sixth mass extinction actually sort of works. It's a very complex process. It's not sort of just a scientific biological process. It's economic, it's social, it's cultural. So I'm interested in how literature can help to kind of make visible the structural and systemic roots of the extinction crisis. So especially how, if we think about the systems of capitalism and colonialism, how does literature help to make those systems visible, and how does it connect it to the sixth extinction? And also, if we think about how we humans talk about extinction today, we often focus on these very iconic and famous species like pandas and tigers and polar bears, these very cute and what we might call charismatic mammals. But of course, extinction is happening among all species groups, also insects and plants and algae, for instance, but we don't really hear as much about those other species. So I have been interested in how literature can kind of create extinction stories around those, what we might call non-charismatic species.
Right. Now, literature is a very huge concept. What corpus did you use to base your investigations on?
Yeah, so I've read very widely over the past 4 years. I've read almost nothing but species extinction literature. And in the end, because you can't really look at everything as a literary scholar, you have to make a selection of texts. So in the end, I decided to work with a corpus of 10 texts, 8 novels and 2 short stories.
Right. In English or American or Australian or?
Yeah, so these texts are all unified by the fact that they're originally published in English, right, but they're from different sort of geographical contexts. So I look at North American authors, Australian, South African, yeah, different contexts, but they're all kind of originally published in English. Yeah, that's what unifies them.
And how is the environment or the extinction danger, how is it represented in literature? What were the conclusions that you could draw from your research?
Yeah, so it's complicated, and literature deals with extinction in many ways. That's part of what I establish in my thesis. So one of the texts that I look at in my thesis is Annie Proulx's novel Barkskins. So Annie Proulx is a Canadian author. Really? And Barkskins is this huge novel. It's 700 pages long, and it also spans 300 years. and it gradually traces the decline of plant species in the North American forest over that time period. And it very much connects it to human activity, to human logging, to capitalist enterprises, and also to colonialism. So there I'm interested in how Prue manages to narrate that extinction of these sort of non-charismatic plant species. And another one of my chapters is about whaling, so whaling narratives and the link between whaling and the decline of whale populations. And there I argue that it's very important to understand whaling in the context of colonialism. So of course the whaling industry was led by European nations such as Britain, Norway, the Netherlands, and that sort of practice had major consequences, not just for whale populations, but also for indigenous populations around the world. So those are some things that I look at in my thesis, yeah.
So I have the impression that I'm talking really to one of the pioneers of extinction research, right?
Yeah, I mean, extinction is becoming a topic that's being increasingly discussed in environmental humanities. Some people even claim that there is this emerging field now, extinction studies. So there are other scholars that also look at species extinction in the humanities, but not that many specifically within literary studies. So in a way, yes, this is kind of a new thing that I'm looking at here. Great,
great. It's always very interesting not to do the so many of research about a certain topic that has been dealt with so many times before, but to be really at the forefront of new fields. How pleased are you with your PhD and the way that and the methodology that you used?
Yeah, I'd say I'm pleased with it. I think my approach was to read a lot in the beginning, of course. This is, I think, how a lot of PhD students do it. In the beginning, you're in this sort of exploratory phase where you're reading and kind of getting to know the field. I probably should have started writing a little bit earlier, I think, in my PhD, because in the end, during my final year, I was a bit stressed trying to finish my thesis. And in the beginning of my PhD, I also attended a lot of conferences, which was great. And I think that's something that PhD students should do, but perhaps also not too much, because that also gives you less time for writing and sitting down at your desk and actually doing the research. But then what happened, of course, 1.5 years into my PhD was the pandemic. So that really forced me also to sit down and stop going to conferences and start writing. Yeah, and I tried to write articles as well as in addition to my thesis. So that was an interesting experience, and I think something that really gives you the opportunity to take what you've sort of read and process it and try to write it into something that's comprehensible and something that's publishable. And yeah, but overall, I think I'm quite pleased with sort of my approach and how everything's gone. Yeah.
But it's very good advice for someone who is thinking of writing a doctoral dissertation. So your advice is, at an early stage, don't spend too much time reading and researching and so on and attending conferences. Do that, but in a mitigated way. And as we might say, stop reading, start writing, right?
Yes, exactly. I think that's good advice. I think it's good to start writing as early as possible. I think that will help you a lot at a later stage when you kind of have to write your thesis or whatever it is that you have to produce. Maybe even try to create this writing schedule where you have a routine where you write for 2 hours every day, every morning, for instance. I think that's important, yeah.
Write every day, right? Other pieces of advice that you wish to share?
So I would say that doing a PhD is a very isolating experience for a lot of people. It can be very isolating. So I think it's important to try to interact with colleagues, to try to not sort of be stuck in your own bubble, but to engage with other scholars, to have conversations with people, try to make those connections, and also try to treat it more as a job. So don't let it become your life's purpose to complete this PhD thesis, but try to think of it as a job that you do for 8 hours each day, and try to keep it sort of a little bit separate from your personal life. And so to have hobbies that you can turn to sort of, get a break from it, because it can be very overwhelming and also isolating. So, yeah.
Good advice. Good advice. By the way, how serious is this extinction? I mean, in terms of numbers, do you have an idea of how many species we lose a year?
So actually the science around species extinction is very complicated and it's very uncertain. So scientists still disagree about the exact number of species that we're losing each year. It's very difficult to measure extinction. It really relies on observations, and it's not always very easy to get those observations and to get that data. So most scientists agree that there is enough evidence now to suggest that the numbers of species that we lose each year, that number is so severe that it does, we can talk about a 6 mass extinction event, but not all scientists agree on that. So some say that it's not severe enough yet, not compared to the other previous mass extinctions. But I'd say that increasingly the evidence suggests that this is indeed very serious. Some people say we're losing 250 species a day. So it's very serious, and the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, released a report just 2 weeks ago, I think, where they established that sort of wildlife populations have decreased by 70% since the 1970s. So increasingly we're being confronted by this evidence that it's very, very serious and the numbers are very high.
Right. One last question, Ida. Out of the 10, you read 8 novels and 2 short stories, you said. Out of those 10, could you select one that you would urge me and the listeners and the viewers to read, because it's so beautifully, so to speak, also accurately proves your point?
That's a good question. One of the novels that I worked with in my corpus is Australian author Julia Lee's novel, The Hunter. It's from 1999. And it's a very short novel. It's about 120, 150 pages, I think. So it doesn't take a long time to read it, but it's very beautifully and poetically written. And it's about the extinction of the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, as it's also known. And it's a very, very bleak tale that I think really manages to convey the sort of seriousness and the severity and the sort of bleakness of a species extinction. So that's a novel that I quite like and that I would recommend people to read. It also sort of pinpoints how capitalism and colonialism, those sort of social factors, are implicated in this anthropogenic or human-caused extinction event.
Well, that's definitely good advice. We're all going to read that, I'm sure. Well, Dr. Olsen, thank you very, very much for the interesting interview, and certainly for the enthusiasm and the energizing way of conveying your point and your message. And all the best of luck for you in the future. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot more books coming from your pen, right?
I hope so. I really want to try to turn my PhD thesis into a book and publish it. And yes, I like to write about this topic, so I hope so, yeah.
Good. Thank you very much, and all the best of luck.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.